If We Were Giants, Part 3, The Forest Giants. Chapter 22. Kira sat atop the rocky ridge by the lake in the soft morning light, trying to calm her nerves. Besides Luan, Loba, and Maham sitting beside her, the clearing was empty. They'd been waiting for over half an hour, and she could tell from their uneasy silence that the others were feeling more than a little edgy too. As she looked around at the bare trees and vacant meadow, Kira honestly didn't know which was more unsettling to think about: having to make a speech in front of the entire treefolk community, or the prospect of no one showing up at all. Finally, Loba spoke in a half whisper. "Are you sure you and your friends told everybody that the meeting was this morning?" "Of course, Father," Luan shook his head. "I'm not a child anymore, you know." "All will be well." Maham placed her hand on Kira's and Luan's shoulders. "This is just a very unusual request for these people. It may take them some extra time." Several more minutes passed, and still nobody came. For moral support, Kira stole glances at the place where Momi had shown her the Bouviac ants' remarkable structure, stronger together. If only people would turn up, she would try to make them see that. Luan started to scowl and fidget with his hands, which didn't ease anyone's anxiety. But then she saw him break into a huge grin. Kira looked questioningly at him, and he pointed. He turned to see Tiha silently stepping into the clearing from behind a tree. The master builder was followed by 6 people who could only be her parents and brothers, as they all shared the same stoic expression. They were also all carrying large knapsacks. Tia briefly lifted her hand in a greeting, and her family wordlessly sat down in the wild grass. Shortly after that, McKenna emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the surrounding woods, leading a gaggle of younger sisters even tinier than her. She waved enthusiastically, and her sisters imitated her, all with beaming smiles. Kira returned both the smile and the wave, which helped allay her nervousness a bit. Finally, Carrie and Mozanne entered, but they were by themselves. Could they not talk their parents into coming? If Luan's friends couldn't even get their families here, what hope did they have for anyone else showing up? The butterflies started to flutter in Kira's belly once again. Well, at least a few tree folk were there. They would just have to. It was hard to say when it started, because the people of the forest were so quiet and moved with such stealth. But as Kira looked around at the surrounding trees, she realized that it was definitely more than a few. People parted leaves in the upper branches to see out, revealing huddled groups of 3 or 4 sharing a wide branch. Others dropped from low-hanging limbs to sit at the base of a trunk, while some were bold enough to step out of the forest and sit in the open. And some had perhaps been there all along, seated among the branches, their camouflage clothing and natural stillness allowing them to blend in with the woods. Over the next several minutes, the forest surrounding the clearing filled with people. Kira turned her neck as far as it could go in both directions and took them all in. There must have been several hundred gathered here, and they kept coming, perhaps over 1,000, even 2,000. Kira would never have dreamed there were this many tree folk. And had she really thought she was nervous before, that was just a mild case of the jitters. Now it felt like she couldn't breathe. Though none of these people knew it, their fate rested on Kira's words and how much she could encourage and inspire them to respond. It all depended on her. When the emergence of newcomers slowed to a trickle and finally appeared to stop, Loba stood up on top of the ridge and surveyed all the eyes looking down at him from the surrounding trees. Kira noticed his hands were trembling before he clasped them together and took a deep breath. "My name is Loba. I was born in the branches, as was my father and his father before him." He was speaking loudly, but not shouting. There was no need. The people in the clearing were so quiet and focused that his voice was able to carry to the entire assembly. I am not a man of many words, but my family and I want to thank you for coming here this morning. We know this is unusual. After spending my entire life in this forest, I do not remember a single time that all of us were called together. It is not in our nature to decide things as a group. We take care of our own and let others do as they will. Loba swallowed heavily, appearing to search for the right thing to say. This clearly did not come naturally to him, and Kira's heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that he was going through it with solely on the basis of her word. Anyway, I say this because you must know I do not treat this lightly, but events have taken place recently that could have dire consequences for all of us, and we will be asking for your help to put things back in order so you may all go on living your lives as normal. Loba turned and motioned to Kira, who stood up. She felt very small in the middle of all these people. This is Kira. She was not born in the branches. She did not start out this life as one of us. Loba turned and looked right into her eyes as he spoke. But I have come to trust her and respect her, and never thought I would say this about an outsider before. I met her, but we have fully accepted Kira into our family. I consider her my daughter, and if you have any trust for me as a lifelong member of the Tree Folk, I would like you to extend the same respect to her as she speaks with you now. Kira, standing before the entire crowd, didn't know whether to thank Loba or curse him. His public support certainly seemed to steady her nerves, but how was she supposed to speak around the lump that was forming in her throat? It had been so long since someone had called her daughter, and she thought she would never hear that word again. Brushing a stray tear from the corner of one eye, she took a shaky but deep breath and spun around slowly to take in her audience. And as she did so, a warm and familiar feeling of calm washed over her. She realized something very important. This was a storyteller's circle. She could see that now. And how many times had she watched the first man who called her daughter perform in front of an audience? Perhaps not a crowd this big, of course, but was there really any difference? She had seen Taro speak to groups of elderly or hordes of children, gatherings of families and unfamiliar faces in distant villages. She had observed him closely, studied the ways he drew people in and delivered the goods. She had also kept an eye on the crowds and discovered something else. Everyone loved a good story. Taro was skilled, for certain, but at the end of the day, he was merely giving the people what they wanted. And her father, her first father, had chosen her helper position perfectly. Taro had seen it before she had. This was what Kara had been born to do. If Taro had felt she was capable of carrying on his legacy and telling meaningful stories that made an impact on others, if Loba trusted her, and so did Mayhem and Luan and his friends, then she knew she could do this. The nerves melted away, and she began to speak. As Loba says, I was not born here, but the place where I come from had many similarities. We also hid ourselves from the outside world. My ancestors built a perfect community deep inside the hollow crater of a dormant volcano. Kira described the towering walls of stone that protected Zidu like a fortress, throwing her hands in the air to illustrate their formidable vastness. She paced around the ridge in a circle, describing the various clans on the different terraces that lined the interior and how they worked together to bring resources to all the people in the community. Making broad gestures to the surrounding trees and meadow and lake, she praised the natural beauty of the land of the tree folk and explained that the Zidonians had also had a respect for nature and similarity sought to live in harmony with their surroundings. Her voice grew stronger as she described her native home. It was the opposite of a memory trap. Instead of letting the dark things in her past drag her down, the bright and beautiful things she had experienced were infusing her with confidence and power. To remember everything, both the good and the bad, was to honor those whom she had loved. She rotated, taking in her entire audience. When you have been born and raised in such a special place, and taught to respect your land and live within their means, as all of you have been lucky enough to experience, it can be difficult to understand those who do not. It can, in fact, be difficult to even acknowledge that such people could exist. She paused dramatically because she knew it was something Tara would have done at that point. That was another memory that lifted her up and empowered her once she allowed it to come back. During the pause, she scanned the crowd, establishing direct eye contact with as many people as she could, forging a personal connection with her audience, just like she had been taught. Finally, she spoke again. But I have met such people. Then she slipped from storyteller into actor, as all good tale spinners must do at times. She described Red Streak addressing his troops. She became the man. She puffed up her chest and made her voice gruff, using hand gestures to suggest his bulging muscles, intimidating armor, and cruel weaponry. She imitated him as he bullied the Nafulu captive and snarled bloody orders at his men. With a rush of pride, she noticed something happening in the crowd, the same thing she had observed when her first father competed in storytelling competitions. People were turning to one another, nodding in approval or making faces to their neighbor that said, "Oh my, did you hear that?" She knew they were with her. Time to press on. And now, these people have come to our lands. You may have noticed them in the last few weeks, crossing the river at the lowest point and hunting in our forests. And if you saw them, then you must have noticed that each one carried as much game as possible, trip after trip after trip. It's not hunting, it's plunder. That is their nature. My people called them the takers, because that's what they do. They take beyond reason. She swept her hands with a flourish to indicate the surrounding woods. You have all learned the lesson, passed down from each generation, to leave a healthy population of each type of beast so the hunt may continue the next season. Why, even the hook hunters have enough sense to follow that rule. This earned a ripple of laughter throughout her audience. Now that she had them, really had them, it was time to lower the hammer, get to the meat of this meeting. But these takers cannot be reasoned with, and they have discovered our little corner of paradise in this world. They have warned us. She paced a bit. No, that's not quite right. Another pause, another scanning of the crowd. They have threatened us. They have vowed to return after the rainy season ends and the river becomes crossable again. The best outcome we can hope for is that they wipe out the entire store of beasts, fish, and birds in the forest and make our home unlivable. The more likely scenario, however, is that they not only do that, but also destroy the trees and enslave us. Or worse, simply wipe us out. Kira paused and took a deep breath, but not for dramatic effect, because she knew this next part would be difficult to say. She didn't dress it up with any storytelling tricks or flourishes. She just said simply, "That's what happened to my beloved community." The takers barged in, took what they wanted, and burned the rest. I am the only survivor of my people. Kira found strength in the fact that she had gotten through that part without breaking down in tears. Her voice was clear and powerful when she said, "They must be stopped when they return, and we are the only ones who can stop them." It was silent for a good long spell while this information sank into the crowd, until an older man, his customary beard long and gray, stood up from where he had been sitting at the base of a nearby tree. "I'd like to ask a question." Kira turned to face him. "Yes?" "Well, these Taker people found us because the river got lower than normal with the long dry season, so they came over here to hunt." The man pulled on his beard, glancing around at the crowd and seeming to realize for the first time just how many people he was addressing. But he gathered his courage and pressed on. He never told us how it happened at the volcano place, though. I mean, if you were all so well hidden for so long, how did they find you? Kira calmly looked back at the man. Instead of being filled with dread at this question, as she expected would happen, she felt a sense of relief. If she were ever truly going to be a part of the tree folk, a full member of Luan's family, she was going to have to be honest about everything. And if they kicked her out, then that was what was meant to be. She would prefer an honest exile to staying here in deceit. She pivoted to look at Luan's family, making eye contact with each one of them in turn, and then faced the old man again. It was my fault, she said loudly. I snuck out one night against the will of my parents. I wanted to gather information on the takers to help protect my community. I found their camp, but I became frightened of what I discovered. I lost my nerve and escaped. And I tried to sneak back home, but they followed me. It all happened very quickly after that. Over the course of the next day and night, my community were destroyed. Kira hadn't truly noticed the pressing weight that had been stooping on her shoulders and bearing down on her chest for years, making it difficult for her to take a full breath until it lifted with those words. She felt new, remade. It was completely quiet in the clearing after Kira's confession. She stood there very still and waited for whatever would come next. Loba, someone called from the high up in a tree. Why did you bring her into our forest? She admits to already destroying one community. Yeah, a cry from the other side of the clearing. She's dangerous. Why should we listen to her? She doesn't belong here. She never belonged here. There were rumblings from all sides. Loba shifted uneasily, looking unsure how to respond. Kira had the same thought she'd had in the hunter's camp. People were capable of anything when they were scared. One man broke away from those sitting in the clearing, standing up and stalking directly toward the ridge. Kira tensed. But as he got closer, Kira recognized the braids and the smooth, easy gait. She started to breathe again. Momi climbed up the side of the ridge, his scarred and powerful hands finding sure grip on the stone. He stood beside Kira and stared down at the audience until the murmured protest faded completely. Then he addressed the assembly. I too was not born in the branches. I have traveled widely across this big world. He pointed around at the crowd. This has been a reason many of you don't trust me fully. I accept that. However, it is the main reason you should listen to me now and heed my words. You people are fortunate to have spent all your days here. This is a special place. It is beautiful and peaceful, and you have taken good care of it. But while what you have here is unique, there are unfortunately people like the Takers all over, in every land. He put his arm around Kira. This brave young lady did not bring the Takers to her home. They were already on their way. They started their inevitable march to that volcano when the time began. Yes, perhaps the actions of a frightened young girl cracked the door open a bit sooner than it might have been opened otherwise, but the Takers were coming, and they would have kicked down that door eventually, no matter what. He paused, looking around slowly, bringing eyes boring into any member of the audience who dared to meet his gaze. And now they are on your doorstep. How you choose to deal with them is up to you. Momi raised his voice, and it rang out to every corner of the clearing. This girl is not condemning you. She is trying to save you, and you would do well to respect her words and do what she says. He pulled Kira closer and hugged her. Did you hear what I said, Meerkat? He whispered into her ear. The terrible things that happened were not your fault. You have to understand that. She had been waiting years for someone to say these words. Momi had not just said them to her, he had stood there in the first public meeting in Treefolk history and told everyone. She had no words of her own beyond thank you. She felt more arms around her, and looked up to see that Maham had joined them. She was quickly followed by Luan and Loba. All four of them held a grateful Kira in their collective embrace. Tiha left her brothers and climbed the ridge. Then McKenna and Kari and Mozan did the same. The little group huddled together on the outcropping of stone, loving and supporting Kira in front of everyone who made up their world. Finally, the man with the gray beard spoke up again, loud enough for everyone in the clearing to hear. I heard your story, young woman, with my ears. He thumped his chest, and with my heart. He pulled on his beard and looked around at the audience before turning back to Kira. Okay then, what is it you want us to do?